7 years ago, they were everything people wanted to believe in. Crowds gathered. Cameras flashed. Headlines praised them like a modern fairy tale finally coming true. In places like Australia, the reaction wasn't just positive, it was emotional. People weren't just watching, they were invested. But here's the part no one expected. When they came back in 2025, it wasn't the same story anymore. The cheers were gone. The excitement had turned into skepticism. And instead of welcoming crowds, there were petitions, tens of thousands of signatures building before they even arrived. Something had changed. Not just in how people saw them, but in what people understood about them. Because this time, the audience wasn't seeing a story unfold. They were seeing it after it had already fallen apart. And the most uncomfortable part, the difference between those two versions, the one people believed in, and the one standing in front of them now, was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a collision between image and reality. And once that collision started, it didn't stop. Back in 2018, everything looked effortless. The tour through Australia wasn't just successful. It felt like a moment people would remember for years. Streets filled up early. People waited for hours just to catch a glimpse. Every appearance felt like confirmation that something new and exciting had entered the royal story. At the center of it all were Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, a combination that, at the time, seemed to represent exactly what the public wanted. An American actress stepping into a centuries-old institution. A prince who had always carried a different kind of public energy. Together, they looked like a bridge between tradition and modernity. And for that moment, it worked. Media coverage leaned overwhelmingly positive. Commentators described the reception as one of the warmest in recent memory. The narrative was clean, simple, and easy to believe. White right pointing backhand index, this was a modern fairy tale. White right pointing backhand index, this was the future of the monarchy. White right pointing backhand index, this was something people could emotionally invest in. But here's what made that moment so powerful, and, eventually, so fragile. People weren't reacting to a complete picture. They were reacting to what was visible at that exact time. No major interviews had reshaped public perception yet. No long-term decisions had been fully understood. No contradictions had been fully examined. In other words, the story hadn't been tested. It was still in its most polished form, where everything aligns, everything feels intentional, and nothing has been questioned deeply enough to break the illusion. And when a story exists in that state, it becomes incredibly easy for people to project onto it. They see what they want to see. Hope, change, authenticity. But illusions like that don't collapse all at once. They hold, right up until the moment they don't. And when that shift finally begins, it doesn't look dramatic at first. It starts quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly, the same story people once celebrated starts to feel completely different. At first, nothing looked broken. There wasn't a single moment where everything suddenly collapsed. No dramatic headline that instantly changed public opinion overnight. If anything, from the outside, the story still looked intact. But underneath that surface, things were already shifting. Quietly, subtly, and most people didn't notice it at the time. Because the version the public had embraced in 2018 wasn't being tested yet. It was being protected by distance, by limited information, and by the natural momentum of a strong first impression. But time does something to every narrative. It adds detail. It introduces contradictions. And eventually, it forces comparison. The first real shift didn't come from one event. It came from accumulation. Decisions started to stack. Statements began to carry more weight. And slowly, the gap between the image people had originally accepted and the reality they were beginning to observe started to widen. Not dramatically, but enough. Then came the turning point. When Megxit entered the conversation, it didn't just mark a change in status. It changed the entire context of how everything before it was interpreted. What once looked like integration into an institution now started to look temporary. What once felt like commitment now raised questions about intention. And suddenly, the story people thought they understood was no longer stable. From that point forward, every new development wasn't viewed on its own. It was compared, measured, re-evaluated. And with each comparison, something became harder to ignore. The version of the story people had supported in the beginning, and the version that was unfolding now, didn't fully match. At first, people hesitated to say it out loud, because admitting that shift meant admitting something uncomfortable. White right pointing backhand index that the original perception might have been incomplete. White right pointing backhand index that key details were missing. White right pointing backhand index that the story had always been more complicated than it looked. But once that idea takes hold, even slightly, it changes how everything else is received. Every appearance, every decision, every new narrative. They're no longer accepted at face value. They are questioned. And once questioning starts, it doesn't stop. Because now the audience isn't just watching the story anymore. They're analyzing it. And that's when the real pressure begins. Because a story can survive admiration. But surviving scrutiny is something very different. At some point, the conversation stopped being about opinions and started sounding like conclusions. You could feel the shift in tone. Early on, coverage had leaned emotional, supportive, curious, sometimes even protective. But as time passed, the language changed. It became more analytical, more comparative, less about what people felt, and more about what they believed they were seeing repeated over time. Commentators began referencing patterns. Outlets started connecting timelines. And instead of reacting to single moments, discussions began to frame the story as something that had been developing for years. Not one incident, not one decision, but a sequence. That's where the idea of receipts came in, not necessarily as literal documents, but as a way of saying, white right pointing backhand index, this isn't new anymore. White right pointing backhand index, we've seen this before. White right pointing backhand index, there's a track record now. And once a narrative reaches that stage, it becomes much harder to reverse. Because people stop asking, is this true? And start asking, how many times has this happened? That subtle change does something powerful. It creates a sense of inevitability. Even if each individual event could be explained on its own, the pattern becomes the story. And patterns feel more convincing than isolated facts. Across discussions, a similar framing kept appearing. The early success wasn't necessarily wrong. It was just incomplete. The public hadn't had enough information yet. The timeline hadn't played out far enough. The contradictions hadn't fully surfaced. But now there was enough distance to compare, enough material to analyze, enough repetition to form a narrative that felt settled. And once a story starts to feel settled in the public mind, something important happens. It becomes the lens through which everything else is judged. New appearances aren't fresh starts anymore. They're extensions of what people already believe. New projects aren't evaluated independently. They're measured against the pattern. And that's exactly where things become difficult. Because when perception shifts into something that feels like evidence, even neutral actions can start to look intentional. Even small decisions can feel like confirmation. And the benefit of the doubt, the thing that carried the story in the beginning, quietly disappears. At that point, the narrative isn't being built in real time anymore. It's being reinforced. And anything that happens next doesn't reset the story. It adds to it. The shift in perception didn't explode all at once. It needed a trigger. And when it came, it didn't arrive as a scandal at first glance. It arrived as something small, almost routine. A private email, planning details, logistics, internal coordination, the kind of behind-the-scenes communication that exists for any organized event. On its own, there was nothing explosive about it. But timing changes everything. Because this wasn't happening in a neutral environment anymore. The narrative had already shifted. The audience was already watching more closely. The receipts mindset was already in place. So when that internal communication surfaced publicly, it didn't get treated like a minor leak. It got treated like a window. Not just into what was written, but into what might exist beyond it. And that's where the reaction escalated. People didn't just read the contents. They started asking questions. White right pointing backhand index, if this leaked, what else is there? White right pointing backhand index, how much of this is controlled vs real? White right pointing backhand index, what are we not supposed to see? That's the moment when a situation shifts from being informational to being suspicious. And once suspicion enters the narrative, everything surrounding it becomes amplified. The event itself, something that was supposed to represent a new chapter, suddenly became the focal point of scrutiny. Every detail mattered more. Every decision felt more intentional. Every inconsistency stood out more sharply. What was originally positioned as a fresh start now had a spotlight on it before it even began. And here's what made this moment so critical. It didn't destroy the narrative. It redirected it. Instead of attention building around excitement or anticipation, it built around examination. And once people start examining something closely, they don't stop at the surface. They go deeper. They look for context. They look for contradictions. They look for meaning behind decisions. And that's exactly what happened next. Because once the focus locked onto the event itself, people found something that didn't just raise questions. It triggered a completely different reaction. Not curiosity, not skepticism, but something much stronger. Once attention locked onto the event, the scrutiny didn't slow down. It multiplied. Because now people weren't just asking what happened. They were asking something much sharper. White right pointing backhand index, does this actually make sense? And that's where the next detail hit. The pricing. What had been presented as a weekend of empowerment, connection, growth, shared experience, suddenly came with a number attached that changed how everything felt. Thousands of dollars. Not as a full package, but as a starting point. And instantly, the framing shifted. Because when something is marketed around inclusion, purpose, and shared uplift, but priced at a level that only a small group can access, people notice the gap. And once they see that gap, they don't unsee it. So the conversation evolved again. White right pointing backhand index, who is this really for? White right pointing backhand index, what is actually being sold here? White right pointing backhand index, is this about impact or access? That alone would have been enough to create tension. But it didn't stop there. Because layered on top of that pricing came the structure, tiers, levels, access points. The idea that proximity itself had a value, and that value could be increased, packaged, and sold differently depending on how much someone was willing to pay. And that's where things started to feel uncomfortable for a lot of observers. Because it wasn't just about attending anymore. It was about positioning, about hierarchy, about how close you could get, and what that closeness cost. Then came the detail that pushed it even further. Not a private interaction. Not something personal. A shared moment. A group setting. A collective experience. Still positioned as premium. And suddenly, the numbers didn't just feel high. They felt disproportionate. That's when the tone of the conversation changed again. From questioning to judging. Because now it wasn't just white right pointing backhand index, is this expensive? It became white right pointing backhand index, is this justified? And once justification enters the conversation, the scrutiny becomes much harder to manage. Every feature gets evaluated. Every promise gets weighed. Every expectation gets compared to reality. And here's the key shift. It wasn't just one issue anymore. It was a stack. The timing, the leak, the pricing, the structure. Each one adding pressure to the next. Each one reinforcing the previous concern. And that's how escalation works. Not through one massive problem, but through multiple smaller ones that begin to align. Because when enough of them point in the same direction, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a pattern. And once people believe they're seeing a pattern, they stop giving the benefit of the doubt entirely. At a certain point, the tone changed again. Not into anger, Not even into criticism. Into something far more damaging. Ridicule. Because once people stop taking something seriously, the entire dynamic shifts. Up until now, the conversation had been analytical, questions, comparisons, evaluation. But suddenly, the same details that were being debated started being joked about. And jokes spread faster than arguments ever do. Small moments became symbols. Simple ideas got exaggerated. And instead of long explanations, people started using short, sharp comparisons to describe what they were seeing. Not because they were more accurate, but because they were easier to remember, easier to share, easier to repeat. That's when the narrative becomes dangerous. Because once a story turns into something that can be summarized in a single sarcastic idea, it doesn't need explanation anymore. It becomes self-sustaining. People don't analyze it, they repeat it. And repetition builds perception faster than facts ever could. The shift was subtle, but powerful. White right pointing backhand index from "Is this working?" White right pointing backhand index to "This doesn't look right." White right pointing backhand index to "This is actually kind of ridiculous." And once it reaches that final stage, it's incredibly difficult to recover from. Because criticism can be debated. But mockery spreads. Mockery sticks. Mockery turns complex situations into simple narratives that anyone can understand in seconds. And in a media environment driven by speed and attention, that simplicity wins. What had once been presented as meaningful now risked being seen as performative. What had once been framed as valuable now risked being interpreted as exaggerated. And once that interpretation takes hold, even neutral actions can start to feel ironic. Even genuine efforts can be received with skepticism. Not because they changed, but because the lens through which they're viewed has changed. And that lens is now shaped by humor, exaggeration, and shared perception. At that point, the story isn't just being discussed, it's being reframed in real time. And once a narrative becomes something people laugh about, it no longer belongs to the person at the center of it. It belongs to the audience. Just as the focus on one side reached its peak, another thread of the story started gaining attention. And it didn't feel separate. It felt connected. While one narrative was building around public appearances and perception, another was unfolding quietly, centered on Prince Harry. It didn't begin with headlines. It began with an image. A simple moment. A quiet street. A figure moving through it alone. No visible structure. No obvious protection. No surrounding presence that matched the scale of earlier claims about risk and security. On its own, it was just a normal scene. But placed next to everything that had been said before, it created tension. Because context changes meaning. Over time, discussions around safety, protection, and necessity had been presented as serious, ongoing concerns. Arguments had been made. Positions had been defended. The situation had been framed with a level of urgency. And then suddenly, there was this. A moment that didn't seem to match the intensity of those claims. That contrast is what made it powerful. Not because it proved anything definitively, but because it raised a question people couldn't ignore. White right pointing backhand index if the situation is as serious as described. Why does this look so ordinary? And just like before, the reaction wasn't immediate outrage. It was observation, comparison, interpretation. People started placing two ideas side by side. The narrative of high-level concern, the image of everyday normalcy. And when those two don't align clearly, the gap becomes the story. That's what parallel storytelling does. It doesn't replace the original narrative. It complicates it. It adds another layer that forces the audience to reassess what they thought they understood. Because now, they're not just evaluating one situation. They're evaluating consistency across multiple situations. And consistency is powerful. When it's there, it builds trust. When it's missing, it creates doubt. That's exactly what this moment introduced. Not a conclusion, but a tension that made everything else feel less certain. And once uncertainty spreads across multiple parts of a story, it doesn't stay contained. It connects. It overlaps. It reinforces. Until eventually, what started as separate threads begin to feel like part of the same pattern. By now, none of it felt isolated anymore. Not the event. Not the reactions. Not even the separate storyline. It all started to connect. What once looked like individual moments began to resemble a sequence, a system, a repeatable structure. Observers didn't just look at one location, they started looking across multiple stops, different countries, different events, different contexts. And yet, the framework felt familiar each time. A recognizable cycle. Enter a location with existing interest. Attach the appearance to a broader theme. Generate visibility. Convert attention into something measurable. Move forward. On its own, that kind of structure isn't unusual. But what made it stand out was repetition. Because repetition creates recognition. And once people recognize a pattern, they stop evaluating each moment independently. They start predicting. They start anticipating outcomes before they happen. And when that happens, something important shifts. White right pointing backhand index, the story loses unpredictability. White right pointing backhand index, the audience feels ahead of it. White right pointing backhand index, the narrative feels calculated. That perception, whether fully accurate or not, changes engagement completely. Because now the question isn't, white right pointing backhand index, what is happening? It becomes, white right pointing backhand index, is this the same thing happening again? And when enough people start asking that question, the pattern becomes the story. Every new development gets filtered through it. Every decision gets interpreted within it. Every move feels like confirmation of it. That's what makes this phase so powerful. It doesn't rely on a single strong moment. It relies on connection. On linking events together until they form something bigger than any one of them could be on its own. And once that larger picture forms, it becomes very difficult to break. Because now, even if something changes, it doesn't erase the pattern. It becomes an exception within it. And exceptions rarely redefine perception. Patterns do. Which brings everything to one final point. Because once a narrative reaches this stage, where the audience believes they understand the system behind it, there's only one thing left to determine. How does it end? At the end of all of this, what people were looking at wasn't just a situation. It was a transformation. Because the story that began years ago felt simple, clear, easy to believe in. But over time, that simplicity didn't hold. It evolved. It shifted. And eventually, it became something much more complicated than it first appeared. What once felt like momentum, now felt like comparison. What once generated excitement, now triggered analysis. And what once stood on its own, now existed inside a larger narrative people believed they had already figured out. That's the real turning point in any story like this. Not when things go wrong, but when the audience decides they understand what's happening. Because once that belief sets in, everything that follows is interpreted through it. And at that stage, even strong moments don't feel like recovery. They feel like continuation. That's why the contrast hits so hard. From peak attention to constant evaluation. From global spotlight moments to smaller, more scrutinized appearances. From a story people followed with curiosity to one they now discuss with conclusions already formed. And whether those conclusions are fully accurate or not, they shape reality. Because perception drives engagement. Engagement drives narrative. And narrative defines how every new chapter is received. So the question isn't just what happened. It's how people now interpret what's happening next. Because once a story reaches this point, it's no longer being built by the person at the center of it. It's being shaped by everyone watching. Now it's your turn. Which part of this shift stood out the most to you? Was it the contrast between then and now? The way the narrative evolved, or the moment everything started to connect? Drop your take below.